We hope you are thrilled by these original Sherlock Holmes adventures. To help us continue creating them, please consider supporting our Patreon. As a thank you, patrons receive early access to most stories before they launch on YouTube. Your financial contributions are the lifeblood of this channel. The link to our Patreon is in the description below. It was upon a stifling afternoon in August, during a week where the mercury had stubbornly refused to drop below 85 degrees, with a heat wave so oppressive it seemed to bake the very cobblestones of London into a crumbling dust. The smell of hot tar, dry earth, and the faint, stale scent of the distant Thames hung heavily in the stagnant air, and the sluggish sounds of passing carriages drifted through the open yet breathless window at 221B Baker Street. I found myself ensconced in my armchair, collar loosened, hoping in vain for a stray breeze to alleviate the stifling atmosphere of our sitting room. My medical practice, though steady and respectable, rarely presented cases of that intricate psychological texture which so stimulated my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Indeed, for a full fortnight his formidable cerebral engine had been starved of fuel. The criminal classes of London had apparently been driven to lethargy by the relentless sun. This lack of occupation manifested in a deep, brooding restlessness that saw Holmes pacing our sitting room like a caged panther at the zoological gardens. He would flit from his chemical apparatus to his index files, finding no solace in either, before finally snatching up his violin, occasionally tormenting the instrument with erratic, feverish strains. A dreadful, screeching improvisation upon a melancholy theme by Paganini that only intensified the prevailing summer lethargy and set my teeth on edge. "Watson," he announced suddenly, interrupting my drowsy reverie and abandoning the violin upon the settee, "the human mind, when left to its own devices, often seeks the simplest, most mundane path. Yet, when confronted with the promise of the extraordinary, the whisper of a miracle, it will frequently jettison all reason with an almost alarming eagerness. A curious paradox, would you agree?" I nodded, accustomed to these sudden philosophical pronouncements emerging from his silences. "Indeed, Holmes, it is a well-documented failing of human nature. But what prompts such a thought on this sweltering, unremarkable day?" He threw himself into his armchair with a heavy sigh. "An echo from the past, Watson. A stray thought that floated to the surface of my mind alongside the heat haze. I was recalling a villain whose shadow briefly crossed my path some years ago, leaving an indelible mark upon my memory. I once described him, quite accurately, as a murderous villain, though his weapons were rarely as crude as a blade or a bullet. I speak, of course, of Baron Dowson. The name, though possessing a certain harsh ring to it, brought no immediate case to mind. I sifted through my mental index of the various rogues, blackmailers, and murderers we had encountered, but found no corresponding face. "Dowson? I confess, Holmes, the name escapes my recollection entirely. Was he before my time in these rooms?" Holmes lit his pipe, drawing deeply despite the already suffocating heat of the room, sending blue wreaths of smoke towards the ceiling. He was a master illusionist of the financial world, preferring boardrooms and opulent salons to the vaudeville stage. His particular brand of magic involved convincing men of power, immense substance, and supposed intellect that he could perform the ancient elusive alchemical feat, the transmutation of base metals into gold. A long con, Watson, spun with such masterful deceit and psychological acumen that it ensnared even the most astute captains of industry. He did not merely ask for money, he manufactured an aura of exclusivity, making his marks beg him to accept their investments. A true predator of the financial ecosystem. Just as I was about to press for details regarding this fascinating scoundrel, a sharp, frantic rap echoed from the street door below, shattering the afternoon stillness. This was immediately followed by Mrs. Hudson's hurried footsteps and the agitated, breathless murmur of voices in the hallway. A moment later, the door to our rooms swung open, admitting a man whose appearance spoke volumes of his acute distress. He was tall, powerfully built, and elegantly dressed in a suit of fine continental cut, though his clothes were dishevelled, his cravat askew, and his collar wilted with perspiration. His face was pale and drawn, a mask of exhaustion, with deep, dark circles beneath eyes that darted about our room with profound anxiety. He clutched a heavy leather travelling bag to his chest with both arms, grasping it as tightly as a drowning man might cling to a lifeline. "Mr. Holmes," he stammered, his chest heaving, his accent distinctly Austrian. "I have been directed here by Lord Carrington, who assured me you were the only man in all of Europe who could possibly assist me in this desperate hour." "Pray, sir, be seated." Holmes gestured smoothly towards the unoccupied armchair, his lethargy instantly evaporating. "Compose yourself. The heat is taxing enough without the burden of panic. A glass of iced water, Mrs. Hudson, if you please. Now, sir, once you have caught your breath, if you would be so kind as to inform us of your name and the nature of this urgent predicament." "I am Baron von Stolz," the man began, his voice trembling slightly as he accepted the glass. "From Vienna. I fear I have been profoundly, ruinously duped, Mr. Holmes, stripped of a fortune that took my ancestors centuries to amass. Furthermore, my life, alongside the lives of my beloved wife, my children, and my entire household, remains in immediate mortal peril." He placed the bag on the floor between his feet with agonizing, trembling care, treating it as though the slightest jolt might bring about the end of the world. Holmes's eyes, which had been half-lidded and dull mere moments ago, now sharpened, gleaming with the predatory interest of a hound catching a scent. "Peril, you say? A ruined fortune and a threat of wholesale destruction? Might this unfortunate, complex affair involve a certain Baron Dowson?" Von Stolz gasped, his pallor deepening to a sickly shade of grey, spilling a few drops of water onto his waistcoat. "Good God, how could you possibly know that name? I have spoken it to no one in England." Holmes permitted himself a faint, knowing smile, leaning forward and steepling his long, thin fingers. "The threads of such grandiose villainy, Baron von Stolz, often lead back to familiar looms. The methods of the spider rarely change, only the flies caught in the web. Pray elaborate upon this peril from the very beginning." Von Stolz began his account, speaking rapidly, his words occasionally stumbling over one another in his haste. Holmes, with a series of precise surgical questions, gently guided the man, bringing order to the chaotic narrative. It transpired that Baron von Stolz, a man of considerable wealth, but possessing a touch of that romantic credulity which so often accompanies ancient lineage and a sheltered upbringing, had been introduced to Baron Dowson some 18 months prior at the fashionable gambling halls and thermal spas of Baden-Baden. "He was charming, Mr. Holmes, utterly magnetic," von Stolz insisted, wringing his hands in despair. He possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of obscure sciences, ancient philosophies, metallurgy, and modern chemistry. He did not boast. Rather, he spoke with the quiet, burdened conviction of a visionary. He spoke passionately of his life's work, to finally unlock the secrets of the medieval alchemists, not through superstitious mysticism or incantations, but through rigorous, observable scientific endeavour. He claimed to have discovered the underlying etheric resonance of heavy elements. He claimed to be on the very precipice of success, having already achieved minor transmutations in secret. Dowson had cultivated his victim with the terrifying patience of a hunting spider. He never asked for funds initially. Instead, he spoke of the vast utopian implications for humanity should gold become as common as iron, the eradication of global poverty, the funding of unparalleled scientific advancement. He stressed that this demanded absolute secrecy to prevent the collapse of the world economy, and naturally it required prodigious sums for unique reagents, bespoke electrical apparatus, and the construction of a controlled environment laboratory free from the prying eyes of rival governments. "He showed me samples, Mr. Holmes," von Stolz exclaimed, his voice cracking. "Small ingots, no larger than my thumb, which he insisted were once common lead, now pure, unadulterated gold. He performed demonstrations in his private suite, showing chemical reactions that certainly appeared to alter the very substance of metals before my eyes. He would take a sliver of lead, immerse it in a boiling, luminescent solution, and after a complex series of heating and rapid cooling, it would emerge heavier, denser, and with a distinct, brilliant, golden sheen. He allowed me to have a tiny fragment tested by a local jeweller. It was pure. It was utterly convincing." Holmes listened intently, his gaze fixed on a stain on the wallpaper, occasionally nodding. "A common stratagem, Watson, albeit executed with theatrical brilliance. The pre-prepared sample, the cleverly manipulated chemical illusion, perhaps a simple electroplating process masked by noxious smoke and bubbling acids. Nothing new under the sun, save perhaps the sheer audacity of the claim and the scale of the target." Von Stolz continued, describing how his initial skepticism had eroded, replaced by a feverish greed masked as philanthropy. He had invested heavily, first tens of thousands, then funneling hundreds of thousands of pounds into Dowson's secret alchemical endeavour. The laboratory was located deep within a secluded, fortified wing of Dowson's own remote country estate, Etheria Manor, nestled in an isolated, heavily wooded region of the Black Forest in Germany. Access was strictly controlled by armed guards. Von Stolz was only permitted to observe the arcane rituals from a distance, peering through thick smoke glass as Dowson manipulated massive glowing crucibles. "He kept me at arm's length," von Stolz admitted ruefully, rubbing his temples. "There was always another parameter to adjust, another rare, astronomically expensive element to procure from the Orient. About a month ago, a creeping unease began to settle upon me. The promised breakthrough that would yield tons of gold was always just weeks away. My own family accountants, shrewd men unblinded by Dowson's charisma, began to question the sheer scale of the expenditures with no tangible return. I grew desperate. I pressed Dowson for concrete results, demanding a demonstration of large-scale transmutation that I could personally verify and touch. It was at this point that Dowson's demeanour had subtly, terrifyingly shifted. The smooth, gentlemanly charm gave way to veiled impatience, escalating to outright, menacing hostility. He accused von Stolz of lacking scientific faith, of having a pedestrian mind, and of jeopardizing the grand project and humanity's future with his crude, impatient demands. "Last night I received a package at my villa outside Vienna," von Stolz concluded, his voice dropping to barely a whisper, his eyes wide with remembered terror. It was delivered by an innocuous-looking fellow, a local tradesman who departed without a word. Inside the wooden crate, Mr. Holmes, nestled in straw, was this. With trembling hands that seemed to age decades in a moment, he unbuckled the travelling bag. Slowly he carefully extracted a complex contraption of polished brass, thick insulated wires, and a small, heavy steel cylinder affixed to a ticking clockwork mechanism. A delicate system of levers, cogwheels, and tightly coiled springs was visible, and from the side protruded a thin silver wire, trailing off into nothingness. The phantom smell of acrid explosives seemed to catch in my throat, and the horrifying realization of what those gears and springs implied rooted me to my chair. The rhythmic tick-tick-tick was faint, but in the quiet of the room it sounded like the beating of a monstrous heart. It was unmistakably an infernal device, a bomb designed to inflict massive structural damage. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes dissecting the object with a frightening, almost clinical intensity. He did not flinch. A rather crude, yet undeniably effective piece of engineering. "Has the explosive charge been neutralized, Baron? Tell me you did not carry a live munition across Europe upon the railways." "The firing pin has been entirely removed by my estate groundskeeper, an ex-artilleryman, thank God," von Stolz whispered, swabbing his wet forehead with a silk handkerchief. The deliveryman left a note inside the package, written in Dowson's unmistakable, elegant hand. It stated this was a demonstration of the destructive power of impatience, promising that the next such device would be fully armed and delivered directly to my study while my family slept, if I interfered further or involved the authorities. I realized then, Mr. Holmes, that the man was not merely a charlatan who had stolen my fortune, but a murderous fiend willing to slaughter innocents to cover his tracks. "Indeed," Holmes murmured, his gaze still fixed on the intricate brass workings of the device. "A man who would stoop to the pseudo-science of alchemy is quite capable of resorting to the very real science of dynamite when his lucrative fraud is threatened. This is a rare specimen, Baron von Stolz. The design itself suggests practical ingenuity and a ruthless pragmatism. He attempts to eliminate the witness, destroy the evidence, and clear his path to further depredations, all with a single explosion." Holmes carefully took the inert device from the Baron, handling it with the extreme delicacy of a surgeon handling a vital organ. He produced a magnifying glass and examined the cylinder. Nitroglycerine, I fancy, stabilized in a clay matrix, combined with a simple mercury fulminate detonator. The genius lies in its mechanical simplicity, making it harder to tamper with without knowledge of its exact inner workings. It is designed to detonate upon the severing of the wrong wire or the expiration of the timer. "Baron, I need you to tell me everything you know of this Dowson. His habits, his associates, the layout of this Etheria manor, the schedules of his guards. Leave nothing out, however trivial it may seem." For the next 2 hours, von Stolz recounted his experiences in granular detail. Dowson maintained an aura of scientific isolation, rarely leaving his estate, communicating largely through a small network of fiercely loyal, rough-hewn servants who looked more like mercenaries than valets. "A fine curtain of obfuscation, Watson," Holmes remarked after von Stolz had finally departed for a secure, undisclosed hotel in the West End, leaving the defused bomb in our care. He preyed upon the very human desire for the miraculous, cloaking his base fraud in the dazzling language of cutting-edge science. The secret laboratory, the carefully controlled demonstrations, the manufactured paranoia regarding government spies, all classic textbook elements of the long con, elevated to a terrifying art form. The next morning saw us abandoning the sweltering heat of London. We were on a boat train, bound for Dover, crossing the choppy channel into the heart of continental Europe. As we travelled eastward, the oppressive heat broke into violent theatrical thunderstorms that lashed the windows of our rail car. Holmes had decided the most direct, albeit dangerous, approach was to confront Dowson on his own ground before he could vanish. Before leaving, he had dispatched several urgent telegrams, including a highly detailed ciphered message to a local German police inspector whom he had aided in a previous case, urging a coordinated, silent approach. Our journey was an exhausting blur of trains, carriages, and hasty meals. We arrived finally in a sleepy, picturesque village nestled at the very edge of the dense, brooding Black Forest. Within hours of our arrival, donning the guise of a wandering botanist, Holmes had gleaned vital fragments of information from local innkeepers, the postmaster, and the village blacksmith. Dowson is reclusive, yes, but no man is entirely invisible when he requires sustenance and supplies. Holmes summarised over a frugal supper of black bread and sausage in our modest inn-room. He employs a local carrier for the heavier items. Dowson's scientific equipment often consists of large leaden ingots and heavily sealed barrels of basic chemical compounds delivered under strict instructions of secrecy and under the cover of darkness. How does he account for the absence of actual golden output to his other investors? I asked, pouring us both a local ale. The beauty of the long con is in its perpetual tantalizing promise. The gold is always imminent, resting just behind the next expensive breakthrough. Those leaden ingots are the very medium by which he demonstrates his alchemy. I should wager Dowson employs a cunning physical trick, either hollowing out the lead to insert pre-purchased gold or using a sophisticated chemical plating process to create the illusion of partial transmutation when exposed to heat. The marks see the grey melt away to reveal shining gold, and their rational minds are instantly short-circuited by greed. The next day, under a sky bruised purple with the threat of more rain, we hired a sturdy phaeton and set out for Etheria Manor. The road, initially paved, grew increasingly overgrown, finally narrowing to a treacherous muddy track that plunged deep into the dense, dark woods. The canopy of ancient pines blocked out the sun, casting the path in a perpetual eerie twilight. After several miles of spine-jarring travel, the trees parted to reveal a sprawling, antiquated manor house of dark, weathering stone. It looked less like a laboratory and more like a fortress. A tall, formidable wrought-iron gate barred our path, intertwined with thick, thorny briars. "Etheria Manor, Watson," Holmes announced, his voice barely above a whisper. "The spider's web." We disembarked and approached the gate. Holmes inspected the heavy padlock, then immediately turned his attention to the ground, dropping to one knee. "Observe, Watson, the fresh, deep tracks of a heavy, sprung cart leading away from the gate. The mud is still wet within the ridges. Here is a telltale sign of a recent hurried departure. A boot print, quite distinctive. A heavy, hobnailed boot, suggesting a labourer or a guard, rather than the fastidious baron himself. The depth of the print indicates a heavily laden individual carrying significant weight." Holmes's sharp gaze swept the perimeter, catching something glinting amidst the overgrown weeds near the stone pillar. He knelt, extracting a small tarnished brass button. He rubbed it clean with his thumb. The uniform button of a notorious private security firm based out of Berlin. Dowson employs mercenaries to guard his secrets, supplementing his own reclusive nature with brute force. The house beyond the gates appeared dark, silent, and entirely lifeless. With a piece of stiff wire extracted from his collar, Holmes expertly picked the gate's intricate lock in under a minute. We proceeded cautiously up the winding gravel drive, keeping to the shadows of the overgrown rhododendrons. Holmes bypassed the grand front door entirely. Dowson is too cunning for such a direct, obvious approach. He would have booby-trapped the main thoroughfare or rigged it to sound an alarm. Our target is the laboratory wing at the rear, where the supposed miracles occur. We skirted the perimeter, navigating a maze of neglected topiary, finding a heavy oak door concealed by a thicket of overgrown shrubs. It was reinforced with iron bands. Holmes produced a ring of specialized skeleton keys, making remarkably quick work of the 4 formidable deadlocks securing the entrance. The heavy door swung inwards on well-oiled hinges, revealing a narrow, unlit corridor, thick with a sharp, metallic tang and the lingering odour of sulphur. Holmes drew a small, shielded bull's-eye lantern from his coat, casting a narrow beam of white light into the gloom. "Hold back, Watson! Step exactly where I step. A man of Dowson's extreme paranoia will have laid traps for the uninvited." Moving with feline grace, Holmes detected a thin, almost invisible tripwire stretched across the floor mere inches from the entrance, stepping over it with surprising agility. A few paces later he warned me to bypass a slightly raised pressure plate cleverly concealed beneath a loose stone flagstone, which was undoubtedly linked to some grim defensive mechanism. We navigated a labyrinth of damp, echoing passages until the corridor opened into a massive, cavernous chamber with a vaulted ceiling. This was Dowson's laboratory. It was a breathtaking tableau of pseudoscience designed purely for theatrical impact. Gleaming brass retorts, oversized and intricate, sat atop elaborate iron stands. Rows of Bunsen burners were arrayed across a long, slate-topped workbench, interspersed with beakers filled with brightly coloured, though likely useless, liquids. A massive industrial-grade smelting furnace dominated one entire end of the room, its chimney disappearing into the ceiling. Everywhere, stacked like cordwood, lay heavy piles of dull grey lead ingots. "The grand theatre of fraud," Holmes whispered, moving with rapid purpose through the room, his eyes missing nothing. He tapped a massive glass retort with his fingernail. "Empty, never been used. These are strictly for show, to dazzle the layman. The furnace, however—" He peered into the blackened maw, brushing a finger against the interior. "Has seen recent use for other purposes. The residue here is consistent with a quick-drying ceramic compound, not the intense, sustained heat required for metallurgy." He strode over to a pile of ingots, picking up a small, surprisingly heavy piece. He drew his penknife and scraped aggressively at its dull surface. Beneath the grey exterior, a brilliant, unmistakable golden gleam appeared in the lantern light. "Just as I surmised," he announced triumphantly, holding the gleaming metal up for me to see. "A lead alloy shell, cleverly and thickly cast around a solid core of pure gold. The great alchemical breakthrough he demonstrated was nothing more than the carefully controlled application of heat to melt away the low melting point leaden shell, revealing the hidden treasure within. A parlour trick writ large. Exactly as I said in Baker Street, Watson. When confronted with the promise of a miracle, the human mind will eagerly jettison all reason. They saw what they desperately wanted to see." Suddenly Holmes froze mid-sentence, his head cocked sharply to one side. His hand shot up, demanding absolute silence. "A faint ticking, Watson, do you hear it?" I strained my ears, the blood rushing in my head. Beneath the absolute silence of the abandoned manor, a faint, rhythmic tick-tick-tick emanated from beneath the primary workbench. My blood ran cold, and the memory of the device in Baker Street flooded my mind. Holmes dropped to his knees, sweeping his lantern beam into the deep shadows beneath the heavy slate table. "A twin to the device delivered to von Stolz, and this one, I fancy, is very much armed and operational." He carefully slid the robust explosive device out into the open. It was larger than the first, a brutal assembly of steel and brass. The clockwork mechanism was whirring rapidly, the gears spinning with a terrifying, purposeful speed. A thin wire connected the timer directly to the fulminate detonator buried within the explosive clay. A farewell gift to destroy the evidence, and perhaps catch the local constabulary in the blast. Holmes muttered, his fingers already working with surgical precision, tracing the complex wiring. The ticking grew noticeably louder, more urgent, echoing off the stone walls. I watched, mesmerized and paralyzed by the horrifying spectacle, my mouth dry as dust. "How much time have we, Holmes?" I managed to choke out, taking a reluctant step backward. "Less than a minute, judging by the tension of the mainspring," he replied, his voice unnervingly calm, though I saw a bead of sweat trace a line down his pale cheek. "He has complicated the design. There are 2 primary electrical circuits. He has built in redundancies to prevent simple, hasty disarming." His intense grey eyes darted between 2 thin wires, emerging from the clockwork timer and feeding into the explosive package. One a dull, slightly oxidized copper, the other a bright, gleaming silver. He produced a pair of small, sharp wire cutters from his waistcoat pocket. "He expected the obvious cut, Watson," Holmes explained rapidly, speaking aloud to focus his mind. "The older, duller copper wire looks like the main feed. It would seem the natural instinctive choice to sever for a primary circuit. Dowson, however, is a master of misdirection. He always hides his true intentions. The newer silver wire must carry the active charge. Just as he used a dull, unassuming lead shell to hide his precious gold from his victims, he uses the dull, obvious copper wire as a decoy to mask the true, deadly nature of the shiny silver one. It is a psychological trap as much as a mechanical one. The ticking escalated into a frenzied, vibrating buzz. It sounded like an angry hornet trapped in a jar. 10 seconds, perhaps less. Holmes's hand descended, his grip steady despite the immense pressure. With a precise, sharp snip, the silver wire was severed. The frantic ticking stopped instantly. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute, ringing in my ears. I slumped against a nearby workbench, my legs suddenly weak, my lungs burning as I finally remembered to breathe. Holmes let out a long, slow exhalation and carefully placed the inert bomb onto the slate table, pushing it away. "A mere handful of seconds remaining," Holmes noted calmly, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "Enough for a clear head and logical deduction, but a close-run thing nonetheless." Without missing a beat, he resumed his search of the laboratory with methodical, almost frantic speed. He wrenched open drawers and smashed the locks on filing cabinets. From a hidden floor safe he managed to pry open. He discovered ledgers detailing the vast, staggering sums extorted not only from von Stolz, but from a dozen other European aristocrats. More importantly, from a half-burned pile of papers in the cold fireplace, he retrieved a crumpled steamship timetable, its margins heavily annotated in Dowson's unmistakable, elegant hand. "He plans to sail from Calais on the midnight tide," Holmes declared, pocketing the charred evidence with a triumphant glint in his eye. "He believes he has erased his past here." Just then a commotion outside drew our attention. The sound of shouting voices and heavy boots on gravel. A carriage rattled up the drive. The heavy oak door we had entered through burst open, and a group of grim-faced, uniformed German police officers, led by the local inspector that I recognized from Holmes's earlier telegrams, stormed into the laboratory with weapons drawn. "Mr. Holmes!" the inspector exclaimed, lowering his pistol upon seeing us. "We arrived at the precise hour you specified in your telegram. Is the perimeter secure?" Holmes gave a curt nod. "Excellent timing, Inspector. The Baron has fled, leaving behind this deadly souvenir, which is now safe to handle. However, thanks to his own arrogance and this recovered timetable, we know exactly where he is heading. The bird is making for the French coast." We spent the next hour handing over the physical evidence, the ledgers, and the defused bomb to the local authorities, outlining the nature of the fraud. Armed with the shipping manifest and the timetable, Holmes commandeered the local telegraph office, dispatching an urgent high-priority wire to the French port authorities at Calais, detailing Dowson's description and aliases. Dowson's flight across the continent was swiftly curtailed. As we learned the following day, he was apprehended by a phalanx of French gendarmes just as he was attempting to board his steamship bound for the Americas. A heavy leather valise, filled to the brim with extorted gold coins and negotiable bearer bonds, was still clutched desperately in his hands when they placed him in irons. Our return journey to London a few days later was far more relaxed, the tension having bled out of us. Back in the familiar, comforting confines of Baker Street, with the oppressive August heat finally breaking into a cooling, torrential evening rain that washed the streets clean, I reflected upon the extraordinary perilous events of the past week. Your composure in defusing that bomb, with mere seconds to spare, was truly remarkable, Holmes, I mused, stirring my tea and watching the rain lash against the glass. I confess my heart was in my throat. Holmes merely smiled from the depths of his armchair, packing his pipe. The certainty in such moments comes from understanding the criminal mind, Watson, not merely the mechanics of the device. Dowson presented illusions of immense complexity, relying entirely on psychological misdirection, both in his alchemy and his assassination attempts. The trick was in discerning the genuine threat from the false safety mechanism, applying his own logic against him. He puffed thoughtfully on his pipe, a look of profound satisfaction on his sharp features. The case of Baron Dowson offers a fascinating, if depressing, insight into human nature. The profound, irrational yearning for wealth without labour, for a magical shortcut to fortune, makes even brilliant men completely blind. Dowson exploited these ancient fundamental weaknesses flawlessly, cloaking his base fraud in the dazzling, respectable language of modern science. He proved to be a psychological manipulator of the highest order as well as a common swindler. Had you not divined his true nature from that device in our sitting room, Baron von Stolz and his magnificent estate would have been utterly annihilated, I pointed out. Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the glow of the gaslight. It is often in the quiet, unseen battles, fought against the subtle machinations of such men, that the true struggle for order is waged. The villain is apprehended, the stolen fortunes will largely be returned, and the precarious balance of justice has been, for a time, restored. The game, my dear Watson, as always, is afoot, albeit temporarily at rest until the criminal mind invents a new illusion. Thanks for joining me for another original mystery. Do not forget to check out our Patreon down below to support the channel.